The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the windows of Whitmore Manor with such fury that it seemed the sky itself was angry. Lightning split the darkness every few moments, illuminating the grand plantation house in brief, ghostly flashes. Inside, the servants had long since retreated to their quarters, leaving the main house draped in shadows and silence. Elijah moved through the dimly lit corridors with practiced quietness, carrying a tray of dishes from the evening meal. At 23 years old, he had learned to make himself nearly invisible, a survival skill essential for a slave working inside the master's house. His footsteps made no sound on the polished wooden floors. His eyes remained lowered, his expression carefully blank. These were the rules of his existence, ingrained so deeply they had become instinct. He had been born on a smaller plantation 50 miles south, where his mother had sung to him in the evenings before the fire. Those memories felt like dreams now, distant and unreal. When he was 10, she had been sold away. He could still remember her face that morning, the way she had touched his cheek one last time, her lips moving in silent prayer. He never saw her again. The pain of that loss had taught him his first real lesson about his place in this world, that nothing belonged to him, not even the people he loved. Thomas Whitmore had purchased Elijah 3 years ago at an estate auction in Charleston. The master had been looking for house servants, preferably ones who wouldn't cause trouble. Elijah's previous owner had vouched for his docile nature, his obedience. What they didn't know, what Elijah had carefully hidden, was that he could read. His mother had taught him in secret, using a torn Bible she'd found discarded in a barn. It was forbidden knowledge, dangerous knowledge. Literacy could get a slave beaten, sold, or worse. So Elijah had learned to hide this part of himself completely, just as he hid every other human impulse that might make him seem threatening. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 800 acres of South Carolina low country. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon, worked by over 60 enslaved people who lived in cramped cabins beyond the tree line. Elijah was one of the fortunate few, if such a word could be used, who worked inside the main house. He served at table, cleaned the master's study, and performed whatever other tasks were required of him. The work was easier than field labor, but it came with its own dangers. Being close to the master meant being under constant scrutiny, always visible, always judged. Thomas Whitmore was a man of 45 with iron-gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed. He ran his plantation with brutal efficiency, viewing both land and people as resources to be exploited. He was known throughout the county for his harsh discipline. Slaves who displeased him often found themselves chained in the punishment shed for days, or sold away to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. But it was Margaret Whitmore who occupied Elijah's thoughts on this stormy night, though he would never have dared speak such a thing aloud. Margaret had been married to Thomas for 12 years, a union arranged by her father to settle gambling debts and secure social standing. She had been 19 then, fresh from a Charleston finishing school, full of naive hopes about love and partnership. Those illusions had died quickly. Thomas had wanted a wife for appearance's sake, someone to host dinners, bear children, and maintain the social graces expected of a plantation mistress. He had no interest in her thoughts, her fears, or her dreams. She had given him 2 children, both of whom died in infancy from fever. After the second death, Thomas had stopped visiting her bed entirely. He kept a mistress in town, a fact that everyone knew but no one discussed. Margaret spent her days in elegant isolation, moving through the grand rooms of the manor like a ghost in silk. She was 32 now, still beautiful in a fragile way, with dark hair that she wore in the fashionable style and gray eyes that held a deep sadness. The servants pitied her quietly, though they knew better than to show it. A white woman's suffering, however real, could never compare to their own. Elijah had served her for 3 years, bringing her tea, carrying her letters, standing silently in the corner of whatever room she occupied. He had watched her grow paler, more withdrawn. He had seen the bruises on her wrists that she tried to hide with long sleeves, not from beatings, but from Thomas's rough grip when he was displeased with something she'd said or done. He had heard her crying late at night through the thin walls of the manor, sobbing that went on for hours. It was forbidden for him to feel anything about this. A slave who showed too much awareness of his master's private affairs could be punished severely. But Elijah couldn't help what he observed. He couldn't stop himself from noticing that Margaret always thanked him softly when he brought her things, or that she sometimes looked at him as if she wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Tonight, Thomas had left for Beaufort on business, riding out just before the storm hit. He wouldn't return until morning at the earliest, possibly not for several days. The overseer, Dalton, was managing the field hands, and the house staff had mostly dispersed after dinner. Only Elijah remained, finishing his final tasks before retreating to his small room in the back of the house. He was walking past the main staircase when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the thunder. Crying. Not the usual muffled sobs, but something more desperate, more frightened. Elijah froze, his heart beginning to pound. Every instinct told him to keep walking, to pretend he'd heard nothing. A slave who inserted himself into the master's private affairs, even with good intentions, was asking for disaster. But the sound came again, and this time he heard his name. Elijah. The voice was trembling, barely audible. Margaret's voice. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the empty tray so tightly his knuckles ached. Everything in his training, everything he'd learned about survival, screamed at him to walk away, but he couldn't. Some part of him, some remnant of the boy whose mother had taught him to read by candlelight, couldn't leave another person alone in their terror. "Yes, ma'am," he called up softly. "Please, come here." His legs felt like lead as he climbed the stairs. Each step was a violation of unwritten rules, each moment bringing him closer to territory no slave should enter. The upper floor of the manor belonged to the family alone. He had only been up here a handful of times, always in broad daylight, always with specific tasks to perform. Margaret's door was slightly ajar, candlelight flickering from within. He stopped at the threshold, not daring to enter. "Ma'am?" "Come in," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, I need someone here." Elijah pushed the door open slowly. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, still dressed in her evening gown, her hair disheveled. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands were shaking. She looked up at him with such raw desperation that it struck him like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I shouldn't. But I can't be alone tonight. Not again. I can't." Elijah remained frozen in the doorway, acutely aware that he was standing in a white woman's bedroom at night. This single fact, regardless of circumstances, could get him killed. If anyone saw him here, if anyone even heard about this, no explanation would matter. The law was clear, and so was custom. A black man in a white woman's private chambers was presumed guilty of the worst possible crime. "Ma'am, He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like refusal but wouldn't encourage this dangerous situation. "Master Whitmore, if he knew." "Thomas won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest," Margaret said, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. "Perhaps longer. He didn't say." She laughed, a bitter sound. "He never says. He just leaves, and I'm expected to wait here like a piece of furniture, not knowing if he'll return in hours or days." She stood up, pacing to the window. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face in stark relief. "Do you know what it's like, Elijah? To be so utterly alone in a house full of people, to speak and have no one truly hear you, to exist only as an ornament, a vessel for children who died before they could even speak my name." Elijah kept his eyes on the floor. "No, ma'am." But that was a lie. He knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible, to have his words and thoughts and feelings matter to no one. "I'm not asking you to—" Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm not asking for anything improper. I can't bear another night alone. The silence drives me mad. The darkness. My own thoughts." She turned to face him, and he risked a glance at her face. "Just sit there, by the door. Just be present. Another human being in the room. That's all I ask." Everything in Elijah's experience told him this was a trap, even if Margaret didn't intend it as one. White women's requests were commands, regardless of how they were phrased. But there was something in her eyes, a desperation he recognized, a loneliness that mirrored his own. "Ma'am, if anyone were to know—" "No one will know," she said quickly. "The servants are all in their quarters. Thomas is gone. It's just us in this house, and the storm." She sat down again, suddenly looking very small and fragile. "I swear to you, I wouldn't ask if I weren't desperate. I wouldn't put you in danger if there were any other way." But she was putting him in danger, whether she meant to or not, and they both knew it. Still, Elijah found himself stepping into the room. He moved to the far corner, near the door, and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. He kept his gaze fixed on his hands, folded in his lap. The position was deliberately submissive, non-threatening. Even in this forbidden situation, he had to maintain the appearance of knowing his place. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. She blew out all but one of the candles, leaving the room in dim, flickering light. Then she lay back on her bed, fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm raged outside, rain hammering the windows, thunder rolling across the sky. Inside, the silence was heavy with unspoken things. Then Margaret's voice came through the darkness, soft and hesitant. "May I ask you something?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you hate me?" The question caught him off guard. He looked up, forgetting for a moment to keep his eyes lowered. Margaret was still staring at the ceiling, not looking at him. "I mean," she continued, "I am part of this. Part of the system that keeps you enslaved. Thomas owns you, but I benefit from that ownership. I wear dresses bought with money earned from your labor. I am complicit, even if I hold no whip myself." She turned her head to look at him. "So do you hate me?" It was perhaps the most dangerous question she could have asked. Honesty could be construed as insolence, but lying felt impossible in this strange, suspended moment. "I don't know, ma'am," he said finally. "I'm not allowed to hate. Hate is a luxury for people who have the freedom to act on their feelings." Margaret closed her eyes. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I can give." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Talk to me, please. I want to hear your voice, your thoughts. Not the careful words of a servant, but you. The person beneath the mask we all make you wear." Elijah's heart raced. This was even more dangerous than his physical presence in her room. Slaves who spoke their minds, who showed too much intelligence or self-awareness, were viewed as threats. But Margaret's request carried the weight of command, even phrased as a plea. "What would you have me say, ma'am?" "Anything. Everything. Tell me about yourself, your life before here, your thoughts, your dreams if you have any." She paused. "Tell me something true." Elijah stared into the flickering candlelight, wrestling with the impossibility of her request. Truth was a forbidden luxury, something he had learned to bury so deeply he sometimes forgot where he'd hidden it. "I remember my mother," he said finally, the words coming slowly, carefully. "She used to sing while she worked. Old songs from her grandmother, who came from across the ocean. I don't remember the words anymore, just the melody, the way it made me feel safe, even when everything else was uncertain." He paused, waiting to see if Margaret would stop him, if she would realize she didn't actually want to hear a slave speak of his humanity. But she remained silent, listening. "She taught me to read," he continued. and immediately regretted the admission, but it was too late to take it back. Used a torn Bible she found. We practiced at night, by firelight, keeping watch for the overseer. She said knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take from us if we kept it hidden. His voice roughened. Then they sold her. I was 10. I never learned why, never knew where she went. One morning she was there, and the next she was gone. Margaret made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. I used to imagine finding her, Elijah said. When I was younger, I'd picture myself somehow earning freedom, searching every plantation until I found her. But I'm 23 now. She could be anywhere. She could be dead. I'll never know. He looked down at his hands. That's what this life is, ma'am. It's not knowing, not being able to choose anything, not even who you love or where they go. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered. Don't be, ma'am. Sorry doesn't change anything. No, she agreed softly. It doesn't. She sat up, hugging her knees to her chest. Do you want to know something true about me? Elijah wasn't sure he should answer, but she continued anyway. I wanted to die after my second baby passed, she said, her voice flat and distant. Charlotte. She lived 3 days. 3 days of feeding her, holding her, believing she would survive. Then the fever took her, just like it took James before her. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained eerily calm. Thomas didn't even attend the burial. He was in town with his mistress. When he came back, he told me I had one purpose, to bear him an heir, and I had failed twice. He said perhaps the problem was me. Perhaps I was too weak, too fragile. Perhaps he should have chosen a sturdier wife. She laughed bitterly. I tried to tell him how much it hurt, losing them. He said I was being hysterical. Said women are ruled by their emotions and can't be trusted to think rationally. He locked me in this room for a week to recover, as if grief were an illness to be quarantined. She looked at Elijah directly. After that, I stopped trying to make him see me as a person. I realized he never would. To him, I'm a womb that has disappointed him, a social ornament that has lost its shine. The parallel between their situations hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Both of them were property in Thomas Whitmore's eyes, one by law, one by marriage custom. Both were expected to perform their assigned roles without complaint. Both had learned to hide their true selves to survive. You said hate is a luxury, Margaret said. I think love is too. Real love, chosen love. We're both trapped in cages, aren't we? Yours has bars made of law and violence. Mine has bars made of propriety and dependence. But we're both trapped. With respect, ma'am, Elijah said quietly. Your cage has a key. Mine doesn't. Margaret flinched as if struck. You're right. Of course you're right. She wiped her eyes. I could leave Thomas. My family would be scandalized. I'd be penniless and shamed, but I could leave. You can't. She looked at him with something like shame. I'm sorry. I shouldn't compare our situations. They're not the same. No, ma'am, but they're both prisons. They fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more companionable. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside this room, two people who weren't supposed to see each other as human had somehow managed to do exactly that. Can I ask you something else? Margaret said after a while. Yes, ma'am. What would you do if you were free? If tomorrow, miraculously, you could go anywhere, be anyone? What would you choose? It was a cruel question in its way, asking a man in chains to describe what he'd do if they were removed. But Elijah found himself answering honestly. I'd go north, he said, to one of the free states, maybe even to Canada. I'd find work, real work that I chose to do, save money, and then, he hesitated. Then I'd try to find my mother, or at least find out what happened to her. Even if she's gone, I'd want to know. I'd want to be able to mourn her properly. instead of just wondering. "You'd make a good teacher," Margaret said softly. "The way you speak, the way you think. If the world were different, if you'd been born free, I think you would have taught children, passed on what your mother gave you." The observation touched something deep in Elijah's chest. No one had ever suggested he could be anything other than what he was. A piece of property, a laborer, a servant. The idea that he might have had other potential, other paths, was both beautiful and agonizing. "And you, ma'am?" he asked, breaking protocol by asking a question first. "If you could choose your life, what would it be?" Margaret seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had ever asked her that before. She thought for a long moment. "I think I'd travel," she said finally. "I'd see the world beyond these cotton fields. Europe, perhaps, or the Western Territories. I'd write about what I saw. Not letters to relatives about weather and gossip, but real writing. Observation, thoughts, stories." She smiled sadly. "And maybe I'd fall in love. Real love, not an arranged match. Someone who saw me, truly saw me, and wanted to know what I thought and felt and dreamed." "That's a good dream, ma'am." "It's an impossible dream," she corrected. "Just like yours." "Maybe," Elijah said. "But maybe impossible dreams are what keep us alive when everything else tries to break us." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and in that look, something shifted between them. It wasn't desire or romance. It was something deeper and more dangerous. Recognition, two souls acknowledging each other across the vast gulf that society had constructed between them. The hours passed slowly. Margaret talked more than Elijah had ever heard her speak, and he found himself responding with an honesty that terrified him, even as the words spilled out. They talked about books. She was shocked to learn he'd read more than the Bible, that he'd secretly borrowed volumes from Thomas's library late at night and returned them before dawn. They talked about the world beyond the plantation, speculating about places they'd never seen. They talked about music, about seasons, about small beauties that made life bearable. Around midnight, Margaret asked him to light more candles. The storm was still raging, and the darkness felt oppressive. "Tell me about the other slaves," she said. "The ones in the quarters. I see them from a distance, but I don't know them. Thomas forbids me from going there, says it's not appropriate." Elijah chose his words carefully. This could be a test, a way to gather information about potential troublemakers. But Margaret's face showed only genuine curiosity. "There's old Sarah," he said. "She's maybe 60, though no one knows for sure. She's the healer, knows every plant and root that can cure or comfort. The overseer hates her because people trust her more than they trust his punishments to keep them working." He paused. "There's also Ruth. She's 16. Last month, Master Whitmore sold her baby boy to a plantation in Georgia. She hasn't spoken since." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God, that's monstrous." "That's the law, ma'am. Children follow the mother's condition. Master can sell them whenever he chooses." "The law is monstrous then," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "How can people claim to be civilized, to be Christian, while doing such things?" "Because they don't see us as people, ma'am. We're livestock to them. You don't owe conscience to livestock." "I see you as a person," Margaret said fiercely. "I see you, Elijah. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I see your intelligence, your dignity, your suffering. See you." It was perhaps the most dangerous thing she could have said. Those words, in this time and place, carried implications that could destroy them both. "Ma'am," Elijah said carefully, "you should be careful about saying such things." "Why? There's no one here but us." "Because believing them changes things, and change is dangerous for both of us." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "I'm already changed," she said quietly. "I can't unknow what I know now. I can't unsee what I've seen." She turned to face him. "Do you know what the worst part is? I've lived here for 12 years. 12 years of watching people bought and sold and beaten and broken, and I told myself it wasn't my fault. I told myself I was powerless, that I had no choice. But tonight, talking to you, I realize I've been lying to myself. Ma'am, I had choices, she continued, her voice rising. Small ones, perhaps, but choices nonetheless. I could have been kinder. I could have learned names. I could have spoken up when Thomas was particularly cruel. I didn't because it was easier to pretend I didn't see. Easier to pretend you were all just faceless servants. She pressed her hands against the window. I'm sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I am. I'm sorry. Elijah felt something crack inside his chest, a dangerous sympathy, an equally dangerous anger. What do you want from me, ma'am? Forgiveness? I can't give you that. It's not mine to give. I don't want forgiveness, Margaret said. I don't know what I want. I want the world to be different. I want to be different. But it's not, and you're not, and neither am I, Elijah said, more harshly than he intended. Come morning, I'll still be a slave, and you'll still be the master's wife, and this night will be something we both have to forget ever happened. Why? Margaret challenged. Why do we have to forget? Because remembering will destroy us both. The truth of that statement hung heavy in the air. They both knew what happened to slaves who got too familiar with white women. They both knew the accusations that would fly, the punishment that would follow. It didn't matter that nothing improper had happened. The mere suggestion would be enough. Margaret seemed to deflate, all the fire going out of her. You're right, she whispered. Of course you're right. She returned to the bed, sitting down heavily. I just thought, for one night, we could both be something other than what the world demands we be. That's a luxury we can't afford, ma'am. No, she agreed sadly. I suppose it isn't. Another hour passed. The conversation became more stilted, the weight of reality pressing down on them both. Around 2 a.m, Margaret finally lay back down, exhaustion overtaking her. Will you stay? She asked sleepily. Just until I fall asleep. I can't bear the thought of waking up alone in the dark. Elijah knew he should refuse. Every minute he stayed increased the risk, but he found himself nodding. I'll stay, ma'am. Margaret's breathing gradually slowed and deepened as sleep claimed her. Elijah remained in his corner, watching the candle burn lower, listening to the storm begin to ease. He thought about everything they'd discussed, all the dangerous truths that had been spoken in this room. He thought about his mother, sold away 13 years ago. He thought about Ruth's baby, crying for a mother who could only weep silently in response. He thought about Margaret, trapped in her silken cage, and about himself, trapped in iron chains. Most of all, he thought about how wrong it all was, and how powerless he was to change any of it. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to creep through the windows when Elijah heard it. The sound of horses in the drive. His blood turned to ice. Thomas Whitmore had returned early. Elijah leaped to his feet, his mind racing. He had perhaps minutes, maybe only seconds, before the master entered the house. If Thomas came upstairs and found him here, found him in Margaret's room. He looked at Margaret, still sleeping peacefully. He should wake her, warn her. But that would create noise, movement, evidence of his presence. Instead, he moved as silently as he could toward the door. His hand was on the handle when he heard the front door slam open downstairs, heard Thomas's voice bellowing for the house servants. "Where is everyone? Elijah! Elijah, damn you! Where are you?" Elijah froze. If he left Margaret's room now, Thomas would see him coming from the upper floor. If he stayed, the master might come looking for him. There was no good choice. There was only disaster. He heard Thomas's heavy footsteps on the stairs. In that moment, Elijah made a decision. He slipped out of Margaret's room and into the hallway, moving quickly but quietly toward the servants' staircase at the back of the house. If he could just reach it, he could claim he'd been in his own quarters, that he'd simply not heard the master's call over the storm. "You there! Stop!" Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. Elijah stopped immediately, turning to face his master. Thomas Whitmore stood at the top of the main staircase, his coat dripping rain, his face flushed with anger and suspicion. "What are you doing up here?" Thomas demanded. Elijah's mind scrambled for an explanation. "I heard a noise, master. During the storm, I came to investigate." "A noise?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What kind of noise?" "Like something falling, master. I thought perhaps a window had broken." "And did you find anything?" "No, master. It must have been the thunder." Thomas walked slowly toward him, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and powerful, and he knew how to use his physical presence to intimidate. "Strange," Thomas said softly, dangerously. "Very strange that you would hear a noise all the way from your quarters. Strange that you would take it upon yourself to investigate rather than fetch me or the overseer." He stopped directly in front of Elijah, so close that Elijah could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Almost as if you were already up here for some other reason." "No, master, I would never." The blow came without warning, a backhand that sent Elijah sprawling. He tasted blood, felt his lip split open. "Don't lie to me, boy." Thomas's voice was cold now, controlled. "I know exactly what kind of animal you are, what all of your kind are. Left alone with a white woman, and you think you can—" "Thomas, stop!" Margaret had emerged from her room, hastily wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked terrified, but determined. "Go back to your room, Margaret," Thomas said without looking at her. "He did nothing wrong," Margaret said quickly. "I asked him to check on a noise. I was frightened, with you gone and the storm." "You asked him." Thomas's voice was deadly quiet. "You asked a Negro slave to come to your room in the middle of the night." "I asked him to investigate a noise," Margaret corrected, her voice shaking but firm. "He stood in the hallway. He never entered my room. He was being obedient, nothing more." Thomas finally turned to look at his wife, and the contempt in his eyes was withering. "You stupid woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? What people would say if they knew a slave had been anywhere near your bedroom at night?" "Nothing happened," Margaret insisted. "Doesn't matter what happened," Thomas snarled. "It matters what it looks like, what people would believe." He grabbed Elijah by the collar, hauling him to his feet. "This is why they need to be kept in their place. Give them an inch, and they forget what they are." He dragged Elijah toward the stairs. Elijah didn't resist. Resistance would only make things worse. He caught one last glimpse of Margaret, her face white with horror, before Thomas shoved him down the staircase. The punishment shed was a small brick building behind the main house, windowless and hot, even in the early morning. Thomas threw Elijah inside and slammed the door, leaving him in complete darkness. For a long time, nothing happened. Elijah sat on the dirt floor, his back against the wall, and waited. He knew Thomas was letting him stew, letting fear build. It was a common tactic. The anticipation of punishment was often worse than the punishment itself. He touched his split lip gingerly, tasted the blood in his mouth. It could be worse. It would probably get worse. But in this moment, waiting in the dark, Elijah found his thoughts returning to the night he'd just spent. He thought about Margaret's voice in the darkness, about the things they'd said to each other, about feeling, for just a few hours, like a human being with thoughts and feelings that mattered. It had been dangerous and foolish and could only end badly, but it had also been real. He wondered if Margaret was thinking the same thing, locked in her own cage of silk and propriety. The door opened. Dalton, the overseer, stepped inside carrying a whip. He was a lean man with a cruel mouth and cold eyes, the kind of man who enjoyed his work. "Master says you're to be taught a lesson about knowing your place," Dalton said conversationally. He smiled, showing yellow teeth. "I do enjoy teaching." The first lash cut across Elijah's back, and he bit down on his scream. He wouldn't give Dalton the satisfaction. The second lash came, then the third. By the fifth, he couldn't hold back the sounds anymore. By the 10th, he lost count. When it was over, Dalton left him bleeding on the floor. Elijah drifted in and out of consciousness, his back on fire, his mind fuzzy with pain. He heard voices outside, Thomas and Dalton talking. "Send word to the Beaumont plantation," Thomas was saying. "Tell them I have a field hand to sell, strong, young, good worker. But he's been getting ideas above his station. Best to move him on before he becomes a real problem." "Yes, sir," Dalton replied. "The Beaumont place is hard labor, sir. The swamps. Most don't last more than a few years there." "That's his problem," Thomas said coldly. "I want him gone by nightfall, and make sure everyone knows why he's being sold. Make an example of him." Elijah's heart sank. The Beaumont plantation was notorious throughout the region, a death sentence in slow motion. Slaves sent there rarely survived long enough to escape or be sold again. The swamp fever alone killed dozens every year, and the work was brutal beyond measure. But more than fear for himself, Elijah felt a crushing sense of futility. Nothing had changed. One night of connection, of being seen as human, and the result was this: punishment and exile, and the certainty of a shortened life. Margaret had asked if he hated her. Maybe he should. Maybe hate would be easier than this terrible, aching sympathy for a woman who was also a prisoner, also powerless in the ways that mattered most. Hours later, Elijah was pulled from the shed and given barely enough time to gather his few possessions: a spare shirt, a cup, the small wooden bird his mother had carved for him before she was sold. They loaded him into a wagon alongside 2 other slaves being transferred, both looking equally defeated. As the wagon began to move, Elijah caught a glimpse of Margaret watching from an upper window. Their eyes met for just a moment. He saw tears streaming down her face, saw her mouth move in words he couldn't hear. Then the wagon turned, and she was gone. The journey to the Beaumont plantation took 2 days. Elijah spent them in chains, his back throbbing with every jolt of the wagon, thinking about everything he was leaving behind. Not that there was much to leave. Slaves accumulated no wealth, no real friendships that couldn't be broken by a master's whim. But still, there was old Sarah and her remedies. There was the small room where he'd taught himself to write by candlelight. There was the oak tree near the quarters where his mother had once sung to him. And there was the memory of being seen, truly seen, if only for one night. The Beaumont plantation was everything the rumors had suggested. 8,000 acres of swampland, with rice fields that required workers to stand in water up to their waists for hours at a time. The slave quarters were worse than anything Elijah had seen. Rough-hewn shacks that leaked when it rained, with barely enough room to lie down. The overseer here was a man named Cobb, whose reputation for violence made even Dalton seem mild by comparison. Elijah was assigned to the rice fields immediately. The work was back-breaking, the conditions nightmarish. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, spreading fever. Snakes lurked in the murky water. The heat was oppressive, and the work was endless. But Elijah survived. Day after day, week after week, he waded into the flooded fields and did what was required of him. He learned to move mechanically, to shut off the part of his mind that felt or thought or hoped. It was the only way to endure. At night, lying in the cramped quarters, listening to the others cough and moan with fever, Elijah would sometimes think about that stormy night. He would remember Margaret's voice in the darkness, talking about impossible dreams. He would remember the brief moment of feeling like his thoughts and words mattered to someone. And then he would push the memory away, because remembering hurt more than forgetting. 3 months passed, then 6. Elijah watched other slaves arrive and then disappear, sold again, or dead from fever, or attempting escape and being caught and killed. He learned to expect nothing, to hope for nothing. This was his life now, and it would continue until the swamp or the work or the fever took him. Then one day, as he was returning from the fields, exhausted and covered in mud, the overseer 𝘾𝙝𝙖 approached him. "You," he said, "you're Elijah. Used to work for Whitmore?" Elijah's heart began to pound, though he kept his face carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Got something for you?" 𝘾𝙝𝙖 thrust a small, folded piece of paper at him. "Found this when we were sorting through the things from a slave who died last week. Has your name on it. Figured it must be meant for you." Elijah took the paper with trembling hands. 𝘾𝙝𝙖 walked away, uninterested now that he'd discharged his duty. Alone in the quarters that night, Elijah unfolded the paper carefully. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the handwriting. Elegant, educated, distinctly feminine. It was from Margaret. The letter was brief, written in a rushed hand as if she'd had little time. "Elijah, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't even know if you can read it, though I suspect you can. I had to try. Thomas sold you because of me, because I was selfish and lonely and didn't think about the consequences for you. I am sorry. So inadequate a word for so great a crime. I put you in danger to ease my own isolation, but I need you to know something. That night changed me. You changed me. For the first time in 12 years, I saw clearly what this system does, what it costs, not in abstract moral terms, but in real, human suffering. I can't undo what was done to you. I can't free you or save you. But I can tell you this. You were right. You are a person. You have value and dignity that no law can erase, no master can own. I saw it that night, and I see it now when I close my eyes. I hope you survive this, Elijah. I hope somehow, someday, you find your mother, or find freedom, or find whatever small happiness this cruel world might allow you. You deserve so much more than the life you've been given. I will never forget you. I will never forget being truly seen by another human being and seeing one in return." Elijah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Then he carefully folded it and hid it in the lining of his shirt, the only possession he could keep truly secret. The letter changed nothing about his circumstances. He was still enslaved, still trapped in a nightmare of endless labor and suffering. But Margaret's words did something that months of brutality hadn't managed to destroy. They reminded him that he was human, that someone, somewhere, remembered him as such. Years passed. Elijah survived the Beaumont plantation longer than most, his body growing lean and hard, his spirit learning to endure what couldn't be escaped. He was 27 when fever finally struck him down, not killing him, but leaving him too weak to work in the fields for nearly 2 months. When he recovered, Beaumont sold him again, this time to a smaller farm in North Carolina. The work was easier there, though easier was a relative term. He was assigned to carpentry, a skill he picked up quickly, and his new master was less brutal than the previous ones. But Elijah never forgot. He never forgot his mother's face or her songs. He never forgot the letter hidden in his clothing, read and reread until the paper began to tear at the folds. And he never forgot that night in Margaret's room, when 2 people in different cages had somehow found a way to see each other clearly. In 1842, at the age of 30, Elijah attempted escape. He made it as far as Virginia before he was caught and returned, branded on the shoulder with an R for runaway. The punishment was severe, but he survived it. In 1847, he tried again. This time, he made it to Pennsylvania, to freedom. He was 35 years old, with scars on his back, a brand on his shoulder, and a tattered letter carried next to his heart. He never found his mother. He made inquiries, followed leads that went nowhere, mourned her without ever knowing her fate. He worked as a carpenter in Philadelphia, saved his money, and helped other escaped slaves find their way north on the Underground Railroad. He never saw Margaret Whitmore again. He heard, years later, that Thomas had died of a stroke, that Margaret had returned to Charleston to live with her sister. He thought about writing to her but decided against it. That night had been a moment out of time, something that couldn't be recaptured or continued. But he kept her letter until the day he died. An old man of 73, living in a small house he'd built with his own hands, surrounded by a community of free black people who had made lives for themselves against all odds. The night Margaret Whitmore begged Elijah to stay with her had lasted only a few hours. But its consequences rippled through both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. For Elijah, it was the moment he learned that his humanity could be recognized even by someone from the class that enslaved him. That recognition didn't free him or save him from suffering, but it gave him something to carry through the darkest times, the knowledge that he was seen, that he existed as more than property in at least one person's eyes. For Margaret, it was the moment her comfortable illusions shattered. She could no longer tell herself that slavery was a benevolent system, that the people held in bondage were somehow content or less capable of suffering than she was. She had looked into Elijah's eyes and seen a person, a full, complete human being with dreams and fears and a mother he mourned and intelligence that rivaled her own. After Elijah was sold, Margaret's life continued much as before, at least outwardly. She still lived in the manor house, still attended social functions, still played the role of plantation mistress, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She began to do small things, slipping extra food to the house servants, treating minor injuries herself rather than calling for the overseer, learning names and using them. Small acts of rebellion that wouldn't have been noticed by most people, but that marked a profound change in how she moved through the world. When Thomas died 6 years later, Margaret shocked Charleston society by refusing to remarry. She sold the plantation, slaves, land, everything, and used the money to return to Charleston and live quietly with her sister. She never spoke publicly about her reasons, but those who knew her well noticed that she seemed haunted by something, driven by a guilt she could never quite articulate. In the end, that night in 1835 had proven Elijah right about one thing: remembering did have the power to destroy. It destroyed Margaret's ability to live in comfortable ignorance. It destroyed Elijah's brief moment of relative safety at the Whitmore plantation. But perhaps, in its own way, it also created something. It created a moment of human connection in a system designed to deny such connections could exist. It created a memory that sustained both of them through their separate trials. And it created a truth that neither could unknow, that the boundaries society drew between people were artificial, that underneath the labels of master and slave, white and black, there were just humans trying to survive in a world that demanded they be less than human. That truth was dangerous, it was revolutionary, and it was absolutely, inescapably real. The storm that raged that night had long since passed, but the reverberations of what happened in Margaret's room continued to echo through two lives, a reminder that even in the darkest systems, even in the most constrained circumstances, human recognition, the simple act of truly seeing another person, remains one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in the world.